everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'm going to be covering the weather for April 27th of 2023. Um, my throat still hurts after the live stream we had yesterday. I feel it was absolutely amazing, if only there were more people, but I think it was still amazing. But for today, there's a slight risk of tornadoes. There's a slight risk for severe weather, not necessarily tornadoes, in these areas of the United States, as well as a marginal risk um, around the slight risk areas too. Um, for this slight risk in particular, I'll show you. It's more likely to be more of an isolated threat. But the slight risk down here is more likely to be more embedded threat because the storms that we saw yesterday over here in a front, or they were developing into a front, have moved eastward to develop into a large line and is continuing eastward with large amounts of severe weather along with it. Um, what's expected with this front as it continues eastward through these slight risk areas and these marginal risk areas is the potential for embedded tornadoes. And the situation for Florida is a little bit more different because in front of the front there is a very I'll show you on the pivotal weather models, but there's some disturbance and instability in the atmosphere, and the potential for isolated systems to develop in the farther south you go, but the more northern you go, in this area in particular, it's more likely to be more embedded than isolated. But as I'm recording this right now, actually, there are embedded tornado warnings for this slight risk area down through the Florida Panhandle. But if we switch but mainly, if we look at the tornado threat, 5% chance, 2% for the isolated threat, and the embedded threat the farther north you go, and the possible more isolated threat for Arkansas and the Memphis area of western Tennessee, as well as damaging winds are likely, as well as large hail associated with these storm systems. If we switch the pivotal weather models, you can see that it did develop into a strong front here. This is all the storms that we saw from yesterday that I covered in Texas on the live stream. You can see that there's also the isolated systems appearing through Florida, and the farther north you go, it gets more organized here and here, and you can we're most likely going to see a lot more of more um, the more severe hail threat is likely going to be in this area continuing eastward, and by the time the front gets onto the Florida Peninsula, there's also going to be the threat for large hail and damaging straight line winds associated with this front as it continues eastward. But then you can also see for the risk that's up through Arkansas and Memphis, there it is slightly more isolated, but still the potential for lower potential, not as high as a potential for isolated tornadoes as there is embedded tornadoes along this front here. But there is still the potential for isolated tornadoes associated with these systems and large hail and damaging winds. You can see that it continues eastward up through here, and becomes slightly more organized, and again still the potential for what looks like possibly embedded large hail threat, and maybe isolated large hail threat. But then also you can see this here too. This is part of the marginal risk, I think. There's still the possibility for what looks like more isolated hail threat, and maybe the possibility of an isolated tornado threat But actually, no, I don't really think there's much of an isolated tornado threat for for these systems in particular, and I'll show you why that is. Um, if we look at um, this system here, as that continues eastward, um, again, it's gonna bring the potential for it's gonna bring along the possible embedded tornado threat, embedded hail threat, and damaging straight line winds threat as it continues eastward here, and then also the potential for large hail and damaging winds. Not so much a tornado threat up through here. The tornado threat is mainly going to be isolated to these areas here. Um, and as well as the possible slightly smaller isolated tornado threat through here. Um, if we go further, it looks like a lot of the slight risk that they're forecasting is for later into the afternoon here. Later in the afternoon, you can see it's more isolated later into the afternoon, but that continues eastward, organizing somewhere around here and like merging together into what looks like more of a severe threat. Not severe, but organized threat, and maybe intensifying into maybe a possibly more severe threat. But then a mini front here. You can see a mini squall line developing through the Memphis area along the border of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and bringing the potential for not isolated, but embedded hail threat along with it, continuing eastward through northern Mississippi, the Memphis area, in southern Tennessee, southeastern Tennessee, and that will continue eastward and then start slowing down and become more broken apart and bring spotty showers to western Tennessee, um, as well as like as well as the shower threat, the rain shower threat to eastern Tennessee, North Carolina, and onwards. Probably not really much of a strong severe weather threat the farther north it goes. Um, but you can see that through the Georgia area and possibly even the South Carolina area, especially here, and through southern Georgia here, the possibility for some large hail potential continuing eastward. And as that continues eastward, it seems to break up as it goes through Florida into less of a severe threat. Um, and the decreased potential for large hail, probably still a little potential for hail, but it's not going to be really large like we've been seeing the past few days. More so, small hail, likely pea-sized to penny-sized, not really large hail like we've been seeing the past few days again. And what is causing the embedded tornado threat here is if we go to the instability in the atmosphere, the CAPE, the instability, you can see a strong instability, lots of instability along along the front here, continuing eastward. Lots of instability. There could be potentially embedded water spouts through the Gulf of Mexico with this tornado threat and front as it continues through the Gulf of Mexico, but also large instability through the slight risk that we're seeing. Also large instability along the Florida coast, the slight risk along the Florida coast, and all that instability stays. It stays and it washes out through Florida pretty much after the front passes. But then you're probably going to get a little bit of a break from severe weather by the time it passes through. But then later, there's a mass of more unstable air moving onto the Florida Peninsula again, potentially bringing more severe weather along with it. But you can see through the Arkansas area, the southern Arkansas area, and the northern Mississippi area, you can see lots of instability associated with this storm. and that all continues eastward with it large instability along this area here too, continuing eastward. There could potentially be maybe a small tornado threat associated with it, but for today, I'm not really expecting much of a tornado threat from those isolated storms that were down through northern Alabama because the lack of instability, maybe, and yeah, and just the lack of instability. But there is a little bit of unstable air allowing for those storms to actually produce through Alabama, and that instability continues eastward. And diminishing slowly the further east it goes. Um, as for the humidity in the atmosphere, we can take a look at the humidity. You can see large amounts of humidity through the affected area for the slight risk. And you can see a strong dry line between very humid air and even more humid air through the Gulf of Mexico and through the northern Florida area. We can see how intense it is along the Florida area. Just right here where the slight risk is, very humid air along the front. But then you also see a mixture of very humid air and very humid air along here, but it's very unstable. It looks like it's very unstable, and then even more most likely staying isolated to the eastern side of Florida here. I can draw that circle better. Give me a second. You can see it's more isolated to the eastern coast of Florida here, where we're seeing the slight risk, and through the coast of Alabama that we're seeing. So humidity is playing a huge role in this. And we can see the humidity continues along with the front going through Florida here, and but there could still be a large hail threat down through southern Florida. It doesn't look like they're gonna get really much of a break from high humid weather as this front passes. Mostly anywhere above mostly anywhere above above the front here is probably going to get a break from large amounts of severe weather for a day or two. But then you can also see large amount of humidity starting to move back onto the Florida Peninsula, potentially bringing more severe weather along with it. As for the what else could I cover? I've covered humidity. Okay, let's cover shear. You can see along the frontal boundary there is large amounts of shear, large amounts of wind shear here, potentially allowing again for some water spouts in the Gulf of Mexico, and large amounts of strong wind shear through the slight risk area of Florida, allowing for the embedded tornado potential. But then you can also see large amounts of isolated shear through the affected area of the slight risk here, and there could maybe be a small potential. Again, in the northern parts of the isolated storms, there could be a small potential for tiny potential for tornadoes with the isolated systems, because there is small amounts of wind shear and a little bit of instability and lots of humidity allowing for it to possibly develop into a very brief tornado, and probably no more than just a funnel cloud and a wall cloud. Probably not really much of a tornado threat, but you can still see as that continues. You can see the front here, large amounts of wind shear. Not so much on the front end anymore, so the tornado threat might die down by the time it reaches the Florida Peninsula because of the lack of shear in front of it. But you can still see there is a little bit of shear in front of it, and by early Friday, you can still see a little bit of shear along the frontal boundary here, continuing eastward. But again, it looks like it lessens over time as it gets further inland through Florida, most likely making the threat for embedded tornadoes diminish over time. what else can I cover? I can cover lower level winds. Okay. If we look at the lower level winds for this, you can see with the frontal boundary, strong amounts of lower level winds along the frontal boundary, fueling any rotation that may develop along with it, giving it the potential, giving even more potential to develop embedded tornadoes, and maybe even embedded tornado threat up through the northern Florida Peninsula. We did see a 2% risk pretty much all the way through throughout here. There was a small tornado potential risk. I think it was 2% at max with a 5% right here, and maybe even a 2% right here. I don't remember really if there was a 2% right there or not, but there could be. And that continues. That continues with the frontal boundary. Large low level, strong low level winds. If we look at the isolated, more isolated threat, you still see large amounts of low level winds in this area here, potentially fueling any tornado development that may choose to develop. And that's really all I had to cover. I may or may not go live. It really all depends. My throat still hurts from yesterday's live stream. Um, and you could, if you were anticipating a live stream from me, I mean, there's other people that are probably live streaming the large tornado, not large, but small tornado threat for today. But make sure to check out the socials for Project Gladiator, and I will have other live streams later with larger tornado threats. And hopefully, I'll see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.